There is a waterway in the Middle East that most people could not find on a map. It is 33 kilometers wide at its narrowest point, less than the distance between London and Brighton, less than the length of a marathon. Every day, approximately 21 million barrels of oil pass through it. That is roughly 20% of the world's total oil supply, moving through a gap you could cross in a small aircraft in under 4 minutes. The Strait of Hormuz sits between Iran to the north and Oman to the south. It is the only maritime exit from the Persian Gulf. Saudi Arabia, Iraq, Kuwait, the United Arab Emirates, and Bahrain all export their oil by sea, and for all of them, there is only one way out: through the strait. 2 shipping lanes, one in each direction, each approximately 3 kilometers wide, with a buffer zone between them. The geography did not create the choke point. The geography just made it inevitable. The choke point was created the moment the world decided to run on oil, and the oil just happened to be on the other side of this particular gap. The question is not whether the strait matters. The question is what actually flows through it, and what happens when it doesn't. Not all oil is the same, and not all the oil in the Strait of Hormuz is going to the same place. Here is the dependency chain. Saudi Arabia exports approximately 6 to 7 million barrels per day. Around 80% of Saudi crude goes east to China, Japan, South Korea, and India. The route through the strait, across the Indian Ocean, and north into Asia. Every barrel of that 80% depends on the strait being open. Iraq, approximately 3.5 million barrels per day, nearly all of it through the strait. Kuwait, 2 million barrels per day, nearly all through the strait. UAE, 3 million barrels per day, most through the strait, some through the Abu Dhabi pipeline. Bahrain, smaller volumes, same route. The primary buyers are China, India, Japan, and South Korea. China alone imports approximately 2 million barrels per day through the strait. Japan has no meaningful domestic oil production. 90% of its energy imports pass through Hormuz. South Korea's industrial economy, cars, semiconductors, electronics, runs on oil that passes through Hormuz. The tankers are called VLCs, very large crude carriers. They carry between 2 and 3 million barrels each. They are 330 meters long. They navigate the shipping lanes with margins that leave very little room for error. Now consider the parties who know all of this and understand what leverage it creates. 3 categories of actors define the Strait of Hormuz: those who control the geography, those who threaten it, and those who depend on it. Iran sits on the northern shore of the strait. It controls the islands of Abu Musa and the Greater and Lesser Tumbs, positions that give Iran both surveillance and military reach across the waterway. Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, the IRGCN, operates a dedicated fleet of fast attack boats designed specifically for harassment and asymmetric warfare in the Gulf. Iran has threatened to close the strait on multiple occasions, most explicitly in 2011 and 2019. The threat is credible, not because Iran could physically close it indefinitely, but because it could make it unsafe enough that insurance companies refuse coverage for transit. And without insurance, the tankers don't move. The United States Fifth Fleet is headquartered in Bahrain, directly in the Gulf. Its explicit mission includes keeping the strait open. The US, UK, and Allied naval forces conduct regular freedom of navigation operations. The presence is deterrent by design. On the dependency side, China is the largest single buyer of Gulf oil through Hormuz, and China has no naval presence in the Gulf equivalent to the US Fifth Fleet. This creates a dependency that China is actively working to address through pipelines, alternative routes, and diplomatic relationships with Gulf producers. The result is a waterway where the world's largest economy, its largest oil producers, and its most aggressive regional power all have incompatible interests, with 33 kilometers of water between them. What happens when the Strait of Hormuz is disrupted depends on the nature and duration of the disruption, but the sequence follows a predictable pattern. Within minutes of a serious incident, oil futures markets react. Traders do not wait for confirmation of physical disruption. They price in the risk. Crude benchmarks, Brent and WTI, spike immediately. In 2019, after drone strikes on Saudi oil infrastructure, Brent crude rose 15% in a single day. A direct Hormuz incident would trigger a larger response. Within hours, tanker operators receive instructions from their insurers. War risk premiums, the additional insurance cost for transiting a conflict zone, increases sharply. Some operators choose to anchor rather than transit. The physical flow of oil begins to slow before any military action has physically blocked anything. Within 24 hours, the first signals appear at fuel terminals. Jet fuel allocation tightens. Airlines begin managing reserves. Refineries that run on Gulf crude begin to calculate their buffer stock. Within 72 hours, retail fuel prices begin moving in markets directly exposed to Gulf imports. Japan, South Korea, and parts of Europe feel this first. The United States, with its significant domestic production, is more insulated, but not immune. Within 1 week, the disruption becomes visible in supply chains beyond energy. Fertilizer production, which depends on natural gas from Gulf producers, slows. Petrochemicals tighten. Plastics, packaging, industrial inputs all begin to feel the constraint. Within 2 to 3 weeks, any country with less than 30 days of strategic petroleum reserve begins making policy decisions under pressure. Japan's legal reserve requirement is 90 days. Most smaller importers have far less. The Cascade is not theoretical. It has run, partially, before. The Strait of Hormuz has never fully closed, but it has come close enough, often enough, that its fragility is not hypothetical. The tanker war of 1984 to 1988 was the most significant episode. During the Iran-Iraq War, both sides attacked commercial shipping in the Gulf. Over 400 vessels were attacked over 4 years. Oil prices moved. Insurance costs tripled. Naval escorts became standard practice. The United States reflagged Kuwaiti tankers and began active convoy operations. It was the most sustained period of Gulf maritime conflict in the modern era. In 1988, the USS Vincennes shot down Iran Air Flight 655 over the strait, mistaking it for a military aircraft. 290 civilians were killed. The incident did not close the strait, but it demonstrated the consequences of military miscalculation in a congested waterway. In 2019, a series of tanker attacks, blamed by Western governments on Iran, created a new crisis. 2 tankers were struck by limpet mines. War risk premiums spiked. The US deployed additional naval assets. Iran seized a British-flagged tanker in July of that year. The strait remained technically open, but the risk premium it carried rose significantly. In 2024 and into 2025, Houthi attacks in the Red Sea demonstrated again that regional actors can create effective maritime disruption without a direct Hormuz closure. Every one of these episodes resolved, but none of them solved the underlying vulnerability. The strait is still exactly as narrow as it has always been. There are bypass routes. The honest answer is that none of them solve the problem. The most significant is the Saudi petrol line, the East-West pipeline. It runs from the eastern province oil fields to the Red Sea port of Yanbu. Capacity, approximately 5 million barrels per day. Saudi Arabia's total export capacity through Hormuz is 6 to 7 million barrels per day. The pipeline covers most, but not all, of Saudi exports, and it only helps Saudi Arabia. Iraq, Kuwait, UAE, and Bahrain have no equivalent. The UAE has the Abu Dhabi crude oil pipeline, capacity of approximately 1.5 million barrels per day. It bypasses the strait entirely, terminating at Fujairah on the Gulf of Oman coast. Useful, but a partial solution for one country. For the buyers, China, Japan, and South Korea, there is no bypass. They need the oil to get out of the Gulf and on to tankers, and the tankers all exit through the strait. The alternative sea route, if the strait were closed to all traffic, would be around the Cape of Good Hope at the southern tip of Africa. That adds approximately 20 days of transit time and 10,000 kilometers to the journey. For tankers carrying perishable fuel economics, that cost is significant. The pipelines reduce exposure, they do not eliminate it. And the world has not invested sufficiently in alternatives to change that calculation. As of 2025 and into 2026, the Strait of Hormuz sits at the intersection of multiple simultaneous crises. Iran's nuclear program remains unresolved. Western sanctions on Iranian oil exports remain in place, though enforcement has varied significantly. Iran's economy is under severe pressure. Its IRGCN remains operationally active in the Gulf. The combination of economic desperation and military capability creates a risk profile that has not diminished. The conflict in Gaza and its regional dimensions have drawn Hezbollah, the Houthis, and Iranian proxy networks into a broader confrontation with Israel and its Western backers. The Houthi maritime campaign in the Red Sea demonstrated that regional actors are both willing and capable of sustained maritime disruption. The question is whether Hormuz remains off-limits as a target, as it largely has been, or whether escalation crosses that threshold. On the energy side, the world has made significant investments in renewable energy since 2019, but oil dependency has not declined fast enough to change the Hormuz calculus. Global oil demand remains at approximately 100 million barrels of oil per day. The share flowing through Hormuz has not decreased. Strategic petroleum reserves in the US, Europe, and Japan exist precisely for this scenario. They provide a buffer, they do not provide a solution. The Strait of Hormuz will remain what it has always been, a 33-kilometer question that the world has not yet found an answer to. This is the choke point.